welcome. That's why. The Peloponnesian. Too bad. I go back. I love it too quickly. Okay, let's do all the work. Ja, tackar. Sur då? Nej!
To tell, we don't have statistics. I believe they were significantly more numerous than many scholars would admit. The other populations, and there must have been a number of dependent populations, but a population we hear a great deal about are helots. Contrary to most modern accounts, these were not state slaves. They were not distributed by the Spartan state. There have been efforts to turn Sparta into some kind of authoritarian socialist regime. There is absolutely no evidence for this in the sources. Helots refer to enslaved populations who were the private property of Spartans. It included a number of people in Messenia, and people could be demoted to helot status for rebelling. Yet there's also instances of perioiki who are apparently promoted to Spartan citizenship for reward of loyalty, of helots who were freed if they fought in wars. They probably became perioiki. And contrary to what is often read, the image that there's a small Spartan citizen body of 5% of the population on top of a huge dependent class, the classic exploiting model that you would want in a Marxist analysis, probably the figures were more on the order of the Spartan citizens and the perioiki, that is the free population, were about half. The other half were different types of dependent and slave populations, and that the breakdown of percentages, you may have had 10,000 Spartans, maybe 15,000 perioiki, maybe 25,000 helots of adult age, or you can double the figures, but it's probably a 50-50 split between free and slave, free and dependent, not unlike what you would have in states of the Upper South in 1850. I think a state like Tennessee would probably be a pretty good model. Otherwise, how do they keep this dependent population under control?
Man from Tennessee.
To do so.
Oh, says with the trenches he went.
Therefore,
land of the free.
Which had caused most Greek city-states to colonize overseas by conquering and incorporating the various areas around Sparta as allies, dependents, and perioiki. And then starting in 580 BC, they began to bring more distant states into alliance. I always think that the model for Sparta is not some kind of Marxist model, but early Rome. Rome had a classification of citizens, Latin status, Italian allies. In the case of the Spartans, you would think of the Spartans, the perioiki, the various allies of the Peloponnesian League, with the Spartans providing the leadership and the officer corps to direct and lead what were, in effect, elaborate coalition armies. And if you look at Sparta in this way, then all of a sudden it makes clear why the Spartans are chosen to head up the alliance against the Persian invasion, why the Spartans can field such a huge army, and why they can adapt this system of coalition command to fight a naval war in the Peloponnesian War, and why Spartans are treasured as officers down to the 3rd century BC, where Spartans are often brought in to turn various armies, including Carthage in 256-255 BC, into effective soldiers. The Spartans have this tradition of training, leading coalition armies, and it isn't just a case of a small landowning class exploiting a huge dependent population. With a view like this, then the Spartan training program, the agoge as it's sometimes called, the mess halls, the sysistion, when the Spartans came together and participated in religious and eating clubs, all of this falls much more in place as a way of drilling the citizens to a certain level of athletic and military excellence, where they would be able to lead and command allies and perioiki, where the values of the polis were inculcated, where the traditions of the laws, going back to Lycurgus, that legendary figure, were also revered, studied, and understood. Spartans were literate. They tended to be laconic in speech. That is, they were austere in their words. That doesn't mean they were stupid. And it's a long way to jump from the kind of austere and modest Spartan lifestyle to the fact that the Spartans were a bunch of dumb local provincials. And in the next lecture, when we look at the economic ties between Sparta and the various members of the Peloponnesian League.
That's fine.
That is a mirage. That is a myth that was being created in antiquity and has influenced a great deal of modern opinions. In many ways, society in Sparta was a version of what we call the early archaic, that is, the early Greek society of the 7th and 6th century BC, when they come out of their dark age, and the Spartans remain wedded to more traditional values. They put great stress on religious festivals, on choral poetry. They did have wealth. They did collect gold and coin plate. They didn't tend to use gold coins and silver coins. Nonetheless, there was private wealth. If you went into Sparta, the houses would strike you as well-kept, modest. One thinks, for instance, of what Amish communities might be like in Pennsylvania, where there isn't that display. All Spartan citizens are supposed to be on an equal playing ground. And that inculcates a sense of discipline and virtue in the hoplite armies. Looking at the amount of wealth that Spartans were expected to have to participate in social events, these people would be classified as aristocrats in any other Greek city-state. They have enormous amount of agricultural produce. Many of them can maintain horses. They could, if they wish, participate in the Olympic Games. Sparta does opt out of the combat sports at one point. But nonetheless, I mean, the Spartans clearly have means and connections with other Peloponnesians that put them, Spartan citizens, in the class of aristocrats. So efforts to show them as provincial bumpkins, something that comes out of Athenian comedy, sometimes some of the witty remarks of Thucydides, picked up by moralizing authors, creating that's an image that really needs to be corrected. And if you take that image as historical reality, then you're really put in a difficult position to understand how they ever ended up fighting the Peloponnesians, let alone winning. The Spartans did have an impressive training program. And Spartan men and women both, from age 6 on, were enrolled in a strict set of rigorous grades, spaced by age. We have lots of anecdotal material about it. And then the men, once they passed out of that training, were assigned to mess halls, a sysistion, where they contributed. I think this training program, especially the mess halls, it's better to understand the ethos involved there if you look at the British regimental messes for the British Professional Army in India. Once you've gone through this rigorous training program in athletics and military service, and what it is an expanded version of what all Greek city-states have, then they go into these special eating clubs in which traditions and values are inculcated, where every member contributes, and the types of martial values, conservative religious views, which are characteristic of the Spartans, were very much encouraged and developed within those mess halls. And in a sense, to get some idea of what the life might have been like, I think we're better off looking at how British officers functioned in mess halls in India in, say, the 19th century, in the British Indian Army. Rather than trying to turn these into some kind of indoctrination programs of a totalitarian state, whether you want it to be Stalinist or Nazi, take your choice, which is sometimes the implied comparison. The Spartans were taught to read and write. We know they're literate. They participate very regularly in festivals. They take their religious values very seriously. They are also sticklers for their oaths and their traditions. When they swear oaths, they will follow them. And above all, they revere and respect tradition and age. There are numerous anecdotes dealing with that, and the Spartan reverence for the law, the Spartan willingness to sacrifice for the communal good and the city-state. One passage, which comes from Herodotus, the historian writing about the Persian Wars, which were fought from 490 to 479 BC, Herodotus actually catches a sense of how that traditional ethos, that devotion to law, nomos, the law passed on the son, was so important in Spartan military success and the stability of Sparta. Sparta did not have civil war, did not have strong men, tyrants seizing power. And this is captured in a anecdote, whether it happened or not. As I say in Herodotus, if it didn't happen, it ought to have happened. And that is a Spartan king named Demaratus, who was exiled by Sparta, found refuge with King Xerxes of Persia. In 480 BC, Xerxes leads the great invasion of Greece. We'll discuss that later on in this course and its implications for the Peloponnesian War. And Herodotus, in his 7th book, reports of an exchange between Xerxes and Demaratus. Apparently, there were Persian officers boasting that the Persian army is so great and they're such great soldiers that they're just going to walk over the Greeks. And one Persian officer in particular says, look, I can take on any 10 Greeks. And he looks sort of contemptuously at Demaratus, what do you think of that? And the great king is amused by this. He eggs on the conversation. And finally, Demaratus is forced to answer. Xerxes wants to know, well, what do you think of this claim? And I read what Demaratus says, under pressure from Xerxes to say it. Personally, I do not claim to be able to fight 10 men, or 2. Indeed, I would prefer not even to fight with 1. But should it be necessary, should there be some great cause to urge me on, then nothing would give me more pleasure than to stand up to one of those men of yours who claims to be a match for 3 Greeks. So it is with the Spartans. Fighting singularly, they are as good as any, but fighting together, they are the best soldiers in the world. They are free, yet but not entirely free. They have a master, and the master is law. Ho nomos. This is law passed by citizens, not themis or religious law, but very, very specific, which they fear much more than your subjects fear you. Whatever this master commands, they do, and this command never varies. It is never to retreat in battle, however great the odds, but always to remain in formation. Remember that lecture we just had on the hoplite, to stay in the toxis, in the battle line, and to conquer or die. If, my lord, you think that what I have said is nonsense, very well. I am willing henceforth to hold my tongue. This time I spoke because you forced me to speak, and in any case, I pray that all may turn out as you desire. Xerxes, of course, laughs this off. What does this exiled king know? And his people ran him out of town. And then later in the account, later in Herodotus' history, Xerxes begins to understand what these words mean when the 300 Spartans under King Leonidas, supported by their Peloponnesian allies, hold back repeated Persian attacks in the ferocious defense of Thermopylae, which is in many ways the first setback of the invasion. And Xerxes, those words must have come back to Xerxes then. What is motivating these people to fight under the ethos of law? And the Spartans come to epitomize that. The training system is there to inculcate those values. And if we had authors who were Spartans themselves, or who were very, very favorable to Sparta, we have one in Xenophon who continues the history of Thucydides, but general history, like King Agesilaus the second of Sparta. But if we had historians similar to Polybius and Livy, who write about the Roman Republic and the great Punic Wars. One is a Greek author who knew the Romans so well. Livy is the great national author of Augustan Rome. Our image of Sparta would be far more favorable. We would have accounts which would stress the Spartan virtues. Rather than deploring Spartan organization as an exploiting class, we would look at the Spartan system as a way of categorizing different peoples for their military value. That the Spartans had a system of command that went beyond their single city-state. These will be encountered in the lectures when we deal with the Peloponnesian League. There was a system of officer training, there was a system of leading allies into battle, and the Spartans proved extremely successful in doing this. Success in the Peloponnesian War. But above all, and it's a point that has to be stressed, that the anecdotes that come bound to Sparta can be read 2 ways. One is an anecdote told of an Athenian who went to Sparta and supposedly was fed the typical Spartan meal, gruel. And again, this is a pose. We Spartans are so strong, we can eat the worst of rations. And the Athenian looking at this and says, well, no wonder the Spartans don't fear death if this is what dinner is. That's probably a pose that's been put out by the Spartans. They're clearly well trained and they're physically very fit. But there are other anecdotes that can be read in the other direction, and the one I always like to think of and end with is the anecdote of Plutarch. At the Olympic Games in northwestern Peloponnesus in the region of Elis, this is the great Pan-Hellenic Games that all the Greeks go to every 4th year, and they compete in athletic contests. And those contests are recognitions of not only the athlete, but the athlete's city-state. So it behooves Greeks to go to the Olympic Games, and participation in the Olympic Games means you are a Greek, a Hellene. Well, we're told a story that there's a series of competitions going on at Olympia, and everyone's got their seats, and the competition is ready to begin. And this elderly gentleman of Elis is walking among the seats looking for a seat. And I think all of us have been in the situation. You really don't want to give up that seat, and they all look the other way and pretend not to see him. And this man gets to the front row, and there is a group of Spartan youths, Ephebes, as they're called in Greek, with their trainer. And they immediately jump up, and each of them offers the elderly gentleman a seat. And Plutarch says, all the Greeks know what is right to do, but only the Spartans do it.
Lecture 4, Sparta and her allies.
In this lecture, I plan to conclude the background on Sparta, as I say, one of the two key belligerents in the Peloponnesian War, and we'll be talking a great deal about this outfit called the Peloponnesian League. The term Peloponnesian League is a modern creation. It comes out of the 19th century, and the Greeks themselves never referred to this outfit by that name, which you encounter in the sources generally ho Lacedaemoniae kai ho Sumachoi. That is, the Lacedaemonians, meaning the Spartans, both the free Spartan citizens and the Perioiki, and their allies. Sumachos is a general word for allies. Sumachia is a treaty in which oaths have been sworn for alliance. Furthermore, the Peloponnesian League is a bit unfortunate as a term. There are important allies outside the Peloponnesus, particularly in central Greece. The city of Thebes, which dominated a region called Boeotia. There were other lesser states of central Greece. And in many ways, the allies, or the towns connected by friendship, something known as a guest friendship, the Messenia, which is a friendship inherited by families, very often prominent families, between Spartans and the Greeks of Sicily and Italy. Those too were allies and were counted as somehow friends of Sparta, allies of Sparta. Sparta could call upon them for military aid, very often in the form of ships. And so the term Peloponnesian League sometimes conveys a restricted sense, that it was only to the Peloponnesus, that southern peninsula of Greece. And really, Spartan power extended far beyond that. And individual Spartans had very, very powerful connections in other city-states. Prominent Spartans would have been proxenoi, or proximus, the singular. That is, they were guest friends to all members of another city.
Cheers!
So if you are a Corinthian, you went to Sparta, you went to your proxenus, that is the man who assisted you, traditionally represented you at Sparta in legal disputes, at religious ceremonies, if you wished to speak to the Spartan assembly. So Sparta had all of these wide-flung connections and really used them to cement a series of military alliances, which for convenience we call the Peloponnesian League. So when I use that term Peloponnesian League in this course, you have to understand it's more than just the immediate allies in the Peloponnesus. As shall also become clear in this lecture, there is one very significant member of the Peloponnesus, a city-state, outside the League and hostile to Sparta, and that is the city of Argos, which is an inland city in northeastern Peloponnesus, is the traditional rival of Sparta for control of the Peloponnesus. We'll be talking why. And Sparta snatches the hegemony, the leadership of the Peloponnesus in the 6th century BC, and the Argives ever since never got over it, and are constantly trying to get it back, and they do such crazy things as try to ally with the Persians, they end up allying with Athens, and we'll see that. I always think of the Argives as the great near misses in Greek history. They're always getting suited up to fight the Spartans, they never seem to pull it off. But Argos is outside that Peloponnesian League and is an independent force. So with that definition in mind, let's take a look at several key issues about the Peloponnesian League if we were to understand the
never mind.
war. First, the Peloponnesian League evolved out of the Spartan genius of classifying different populations in dependence to Sparta, but a dependence that had a reciprocity relationship. That is, the Perioiki got protection from Sparta, they provided military service. Well, when Sparta moved outside of Messenia and Laconia, the southern 40% of Peloponnesus, which tends to form a unit, there's a major mountain range across central Peloponnese and Arcadia. When they moved beyond that, the Spartans had to come up with new ways of associating with Greek city-states and tapping into their military and political power. and they devised a system of alliances. And they did it for several reasons. One was they wanted those allies against Argos, and there were cities willing to ally against Argos. And second, Sparta also wanted those allies as a ring of protection so that the Spartan system at home in Laconia and Messenia was protected, that helots and dependent populations would not rebel from Sparta. So those two major themes are what pushed Spartan development. The second important point I would stress is that Sparta stood at the southern terminus of a set of land routes that stretched across the Peloponnesus to the Gulf of Corinth and to the Isthmus of Corinth. And you have to see, if you look at the map of Greece, you have this arm of the Mediterranean called the Gulf of Corinth that nearly cuts the Greek peninsula in half. And then on its eastern side is this region known as the Saronic Gulf. Athens' port is on the Saronic Gulf, but so are other important cities, notably Megara, a Dorian city and ally of Sparta, the island polis of Aegina or Aegina. The city of Corinth has a port on the Saronic Gulf as well as on the Gulf of Corinth.
Saronic Gulf.
The Roman historian Horace liked to call Corinth Bimarinus, that is double C. And those waterways, the Gulf of Corinth and the Saronic Gulf together, form a passageway across Greece. Ships generally went in the Gulf of Corinth, or if they're approaching from the Saronic Gulf, to Corinth itself. And Corinth had a system of rollers where they take the ships up, and it's called the Diolkos, and drag them across the isthmus. Of course, they charged them for the service and allowed many ships to avoid the perilous journey around the Peloponnesus. So, furthermore, the Gulf of Corinth was a passageway from Peloponnesus to central Greece, and then by a series of passes to Thermopylae, to Thessaly, ultimately to Macedon. So, what is mostly land, what we would today call inland Greece or land Greece today, stretching from Macedon through Thessaly, through central Greece to Peloponnesus, that was an economic trade axis. And in many ways, what the Peloponnesian League was the political and military expression of those set of trade routes, connections, linguistic ties, festivals that had long bound that region together. And this is becoming increasingly clear through the archaeology, the study of coin hoards, the exports of ceramics. What Sparta did was give a political expression, a political unity, to a region that was long tied together. The other axis I mentioned is Athens and the Aegean, which we'll get to in the coming lectures, so that Sparta ends up taking over the hegemony of the land regions of Greece. And so it's not only the Spartan security interests, but there's also these other ties upon which Sparta could build. Furthermore, the Gulf of Corinth takes ships naturally out to the western waters known as the Ionian Sea. It's a little confusing. The Ionian Sea is actually to the west of Greece, and Ionia is actually to the east of Greece, and that's because the designation is by dialect terms. You go into what is the Ionian Sea, you sail up the western islands of Greece, you cross over to the heel of Italy, to Taros, a Spartan colony, and then sail along the coast of Italy to Sicily, these very, very rich colonies in Sicily and southern Italy, which are tied to Peloponnesus and central Greece. Sparta and most of her allies looked west, looked to the exploitation of resources in the west, and Corinth, Sicyon, two cities on the Gulf of Corinth, Megara at the northern tip of the Isthmus of Corinth, Aegina, the island in the Saronic Gulf, all were great commercial powers, all engaged in colonization activities, all economic centers, manufacturing centers. They're all brought into the Spartan alliance, and most of them very much look to the western colonies, which explains part of the orientation of the League. Well, how did the Spartans end up running this outfit, this league that I've just sketched out in its geographic and economic terms? Well, it goes back to a contest with Argos, which in some ways may actually be rooted in the Bronze Age and the various legendary traditions. If you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, the great lord of Greece at that time was a man named Agamemnon, who's caught up with all sorts of problems with his wife Clytemnestra, and his brother Menelaus, the unfortunate husband of Helen, so-called cause of the Trojan War, rules in Sparta. And there was apparently a memory in the Bronze Age that Mycenae, which is in northeastern Peloponnesus, in the region known as the Argolid, was somehow the dominant power of the Greek world in that remote Bronze Age, which the Greeks pretty much remembered as a legendary tradition. When the Greek city-states, after they come out of their dark age, reassert themselves as political states with effective power, they adopt the hoplite fighting, they become more prosperous. Power in the Argolid had shifted from Mycenae to Argos, and the two cities are essentially on the same plane. You stand on the Acropolis of Mycenae, you see Argos across the way. And
yeah, okay.
Just a small version of Argos in the classical age. Argos emerges as the powerful state. It controls a very large plain. It has a large population. Excavations have realized that the Argives were among the first to use the hoplite training. We have a full panoply, that is a full suit of armor, from about 700 BC or 725
yeah,
BC.
the wrong
The local museum in Argos, which is really quite a stunning piece of work. Well, Argos, under a series of hereditary kings, who the most famous is a man called Phaedon, in the 8th century tried to resurrect that political legacy of Argos, for which read Mycenae in the Bronze Age, would dominate the Peloponnesus. The Argives tried to take control of the Olympic Games, as described in the last lecture. They also tried to press their claims against the emerging economic centers of the Peloponnesus, Corinth, Sicyon, Aegina, Megara. In effect, they wanted to build some kind of state or kingdom in the Peloponnesus based on the traditions of the old Mycenaean age. Well, Sparta came to challenge them. And the Spartans and Argives, in effect, over the course of the 7th and 6th century BC, fought for the right to enroll alliances and to take the lead and organize the political unity of the Peloponnesus, and the Spartans won. It was by no means inevitable. First, the Spartans and Argives clashed over certain border regions. These are often known as Kynuria, Thyria. These are regions between Laconia and the Argolid. They control strategic passes. In 669 BC, the Argives win a stunning victory over the Spartans. In the next year, some of the Messenians revolt. The Spartans are busy putting down the Messenian rebellion in what is known as the Second Messenian War. There are further clashes. And what is at stake are the roads that lead into central Greece known as Arcadia, particularly to the cities of Tegea and Achaea, then across the Argolid to Corinth and the Isthmus, and finally to Megara, which controls the strategic passes out of the Peloponnesus into Boeotia and into Attica, that is, into central Greece. Think of Megara as more important for those strategic land passes than any economic power or fleet. And in that sense, as a very rough equivalent, you can think of Megara as sort of the Belgium of ancient Greece. It has the misfortune of being smack in the middle of all the key routes that all the major powers want to control: Thebes, Athens, Corinth, and Sparta. Well, that route that would lead you into central Greece, in a sense what the Spartans want is to conclude a series of alliances with those cities, extend Spartan power, and to confine Argos. And it climaxes in a battle described by Herodotus, dated about 546 BC, perhaps a little earlier. Obviously, the Argives and the Spartans had clashed for at least several generations before they agreed to this. But it was agreed that the issue of the borderlands, Kynuria, Thyria, these other regions, would be determined by a battle of champions. What it was a city-state version of single combat. The Spartans produced 300 men, the Argives produced 300 men, and they were to fight, and winner takes all. Well, in the course of the battle that went on all day, everyone killed each other except 3 guys were left standing at the end. 2 Argives and 1 Spartan. The Argives, as it was getting late, said, well, there's 2 of us, 1 of you, we won, they went home. The Spartan stood his ground, and when the Argives left, he stripped the Argive dead and he set up a trophy, that is a turning point, and claimed victory. He did not give up the field. And that meant if the Argives wanted to get their dead back for burial, they would have to do it under treaty, and the Greek for that is hupotas spoudas, under an armistice, and that would mean a recognition that the Spartans had won, they had control of the border area, and they were in effect the hegemon, the top guy in Peloponnesus. Well, the Argives contested this and said, well, there are 2 of us and 1 of you. The Spartans said, that numbers don't matter. It's the bravery that matters. And so the 2 armies clashed in a full-scale battle, and the Spartans won. And the Argives never really get over this. I mean, they still remember this battle in the Peloponnesian in 420 BC when they signed a treaty with with Sparta, and they asked the Spartans, could we have in that treaty the option at our pleasure to renew a 300 battle, single combat issue? And the Spartans say, yeah. But that battle proved a turning point because it persuaded the economic centers of the Peloponnese to hook up with Sparta. And these included very, very powerful commercial states: Corinth, Sicyon, Aegina, Megara, all of them with large fleets, all of them with important commercial interests overseas, many of them at this point in the 6th century BC in the forefront of Greek economic and cultural developments. What did Sparta have to offer these cities? Well, in part, it had protection from Argos. Argos wanted to control these cities. Sparta assured that the governments in these cities would be legitimate. They were all oligarchies, that is, ruled by the landed classes. They were assured of their autonomy and freedom. Autonomia, kai, and eleutheria, the two key words in Greek. They were allowed to live under their own laws, and they were not to be interfered with by Sparta. They would provide military aid to assist Sparta in all enemies, domestic and foreign. That would include rebels in the Spartan system, like Helots or Messenians, whatever. Sparta, in turn, agreed to respect these governments and protect them, especially against Argos and would-be tyrants, that is, strong men who would try to overthrow constitutional rule. The Spartans were very good in their word ethics. They threw tyrants out and imposed legitimate constitutions throughout the Peloponnesus and central Greece in the 6th century BC. Another important point of it is that the Spartans had this rich agricultural hinterland. I noted in the other lecture that the Spartan citizen class was very, very wealthy. And they marketed their produce to feed the growing population in the commercial centers, which in turn probably was involved in manufacturing arms and other goods that the Spartans needed. So the Peloponnesian alliance had economic ties and contact. They were also bound together by speaking the common Dorian dialect. And that was more than just a dialect. Sometimes it's hard to classify these Greek dialects. They're almost bordering on the difference as, say, Norwegian and Danish today. Or are they dialects or are they independent languages? It's hard to tell. But with those dialects went certain types of cults, certain types of ways of worshiping the gods, specific festivals, ancestral traditions and legends, and they felt themselves a distinct group within the wider Greek community, separate from Aeolian and Ionian speakers. And Athens had that connection with the Ionian speakers. So you had these very powerful linguistic and traditional and religious ties to build on, as well as the economic ties. And it wasn't just the matter of the fear of Argos and that Sparta was a big and tough power. There were a number of building blocks for putting these alliances together. Spartan success proved stunning. In the 6th century BC, one of the reasons why archaic Greek culture bloomed so rapidly is the Spartans imposed political order. They shut down the constant internecine city-state warfare that had probably characterized Greek history for 200 years. They were now all allies of Sparta. They weren't supposed to fight with each other the way they used to. And this sees, for instance, the development of Olympia as a great international shrine, the Olympic Games, the emergence of Delphi as the great oracle common to the Greeks. The Spartans are very assiduous at consulting the oracles. In effect, you can speak of a Pax Laconia, a Laconian peace that is imposed by the Spartans throughout central and southern Greece in the 6th and early 5th century BC. And that goes a far way in explaining when the Persians show up in 480 BC, while most of the Greeks instinctively turn to Sparta as their leader. Sparta has taken that role. The Spartans have a tradition of commanding coalition armies, even coalition fleets. Twice in this period, the Spartans send out fleets into the Greek islands to overthrow tyrants. The success of the Spartans also depended on a remarkable set of kings. The most interesting of them and dynamic, a man named Cleomenes, Cleomenes I, who ruled from about 520 to 490 BC. And he is the architect of many of these alliances that put together the early Peloponnesian League and gave the League the structure and substance that enabled it to stand against the Persian invasion. Now, Cleomenes himself is a controversial figure. Herodotus has a lot of anecdotes about him. He ends up committing suicide in a very strange sadomasochistic way in prison. Some argue that it was judicial murder on the part of the Spartan authorities. He rigs the Delphic oracle to run his fellow king out of Sparta, Demaratus, by bribing the Pythia. That's the woman who gives the oracle. That was a scandal that came out. Many Spartans put it down to the fact that Cleomenes drank unmixed wine. In Greece, you mixed your wine with water. You didn't drink your wine neat. And Cleomenes hung around with all these guys from Thrace, Scythians, barbarians, who drank the wine straight. And one argument is, well, he went unbalanced because of that. And there's a tradition in the Agia, the senior line of Spartan kings, of having these rather brilliant but erratic kings who come and go like this. But all this aside, Cleomenes was important in humbling the power of Argos, famous victory in 494, in cementing the various alliances, and arresting those members of the Peloponnesian League who were Medeizers, that is, they would favor the Persians. Medes and Persians are the two Iranian peoples that are the basis of the Persian Empire. And a great deal of credit goes to Cleomenes. In some ways, he's the unspoken architect of the victory over Xerxes, because he put the Peloponnesian League in such good shape. The League itself has been subject to a series of analyses by modern historians. And how did it exactly function? And the inner workings of that League as it stood in 480 BC, when Cleomenes and his successors had finished signing up all the states in alliance, that League has been subject to several different interpretations, and that's fundamental in understanding how the Peloponnesian War broke out. To simplify the issue a bit, one way of looking at this League is that it is a series of alliances, separate alliances between Sparta and each individual state. Bilateral would be the political science term, in which Sparta promised to respect the member state, and the member state would pledge military forces to Sparta. In this type of vision, the League is extremely loose. The Spartans ask for forces as they need them. The League is largely dictated by practical concerns. If Sparta is strong, she can dictate her position to her various allies. But if the Spartans are internally weak or they're politically divided, the League members can operate pretty much as independent operators. This would be true of two of the most powerful members of the League, Corinth, the great commercial power on the Isthmus, which was a very large a great naval power, and that is before the Athenians built their fleet, and a city that was very populous, very wealthy, notorious for its swinging life. I think in St. Paul, the verb to be depraved is to act like a Corinthian. Corintho-izomai, a middle voice verb. The other power is Thebes, in central Greece, in Boeotia, which attempted to unite that district into a federal league and produced what were reputedly the second best hoplites in Greece after the Spartans. It's argued under this loose structure that Thebes and Corinth could be very independent of Sparta. And so you end up with a vision of the Peloponnesian Wars. Well, the Spartans really couldn't control their allies. And the Corinthians could bring on the war. The Thebans could pressure the Spartans into doing something they don't want. And that realpolitik is what really dictated the League. A state like Megara was important because of its strategic position. It controlled those vital passes, but not because of its military power. Another view is, however, that this League was more than just a loose set of alliances brought together out of cynical pragmatism and in opposition to Argos. And I would fall in that camp. The Leagues involved the swearing of oaths. There's a tendency in analyzing the Peloponnesian War and reading Thucydides to become seduced by his analysis of political events. Thucydides, unlike Herodotus and many later historians, has no indication of divine fortune, divine chance, or plan. He deals strictly in cause and effect, and he explains what he believes are the real purposes behind actions. And it's easy to assume that all Greeks operated this way, that all Greeks saw realpolitik, or at least Athenians did, that they all were as blunt as Bismarck in arranging diplomatic situations in the Greek world. And I don't think that's the case. The Spartans were a deeply religious people. So were the other members of the Peloponnesian League, and even the Athenians. When they swore oaths to the gods, they intended to keep them. And you have to understand that oaths and religious language is very close to legal language in the ancient world. The relationship with the gods was a legally binding contract. As the Romans would put it, do ut deus. I give in order that you give. You approach the divinity. You promise to act a certain way, and the gods will return it. And the sense of taking oaths to one's traditions and ancestors, if you swear falsely, the gods will punish the community. There won't be an individual reckoning. It'll be an atonement of the entire community, and there aren't any innocent bystanders. And these oaths are extremely formidable. If it goes the wrong way, may you not have descendants, may you not have children, may it fall down upon you. And one point that becomes clear through the whole of Thucydides, even though he doesn't mention it, both the Athenians and the Spartans, in the final crisis, they're very loath to be the first to declare war. They're trying to find a reason on the other side to go to war. And it's just not posturing. They take the oaths quite seriously, and when the Spartans have setbacks, they often take it as the disfavor of the gods. Well, maybe they went the wrong way. So the structure in the Peloponnesian League, there were a series of constitutional arrangements. The Spartans regularly discussed policy that involved the League. If there was a major war to be waged, the Spartan Assembly would meet. The various members of the Peloponnesian League could send representatives. If the Spartan Assembly decided to take an action, then the League would have to agree to it. If the League did not agree to it, and there's a couple of embarrassing instances, one is with Cleomenes I, if the League forces think the war or the operation is unjustified and they refuse to participate, well, then everything is stalled. And so the Spartans have a tradition of respecting the autonomy and the freedom of their allies. There's a certain give and take, there's a certain constitutional set of rules in which events get done. And the Spartans are the first city-state to evolve these types of rules outside of that very intense and that unique tradition of each city-state as its own entity. Furthermore, the Spartans, in commanding these allied forces, got very good at doing it. And they were assisted by two facts. One is they still had kings. The kings acted as commanders on campaign, and the kings gave a unity to the Spartans, the Perioiki, those helots that came along as servants or light infantry, and the allies. And in this sense, you can think of the Spartan monarchs functioning in the way the crown gave a unity to the British Army of the 19th and early 20th century. While it is a parliamentary system, nonetheless, the officers all agreed that there was a crown, there was a lord to serve, and that was the king or the queen in the case of Victoria in the 19th century. And that image was very powerful in giving unity. And Spartan kings were trained to be commanders. So the fact that the Spartans had these kings as hereditary commanders gave a certain unity to these coalition armies, which was different from Athens and every other city-state, in which they were elected officials, elected annually, and they were worried if things went wrong, they would lose their office, or in the case of Athens, they could end up being prosecuted in a law court. So that was one advantage that the Peloponnesian League had in its leadership. The second was that training system I talked about in the last lecture. And that is, the Spartans were trained to be officers. And they had a series of titles that we encounter. A symbolos, an advisor, a navarch, a Spartan commander to naval forces. These were traditional titles in which Spartan officers would act as advisors to allied contingents. In the course of the 5th and 4th century BC, more and more allied states acquire Spartan drill. The Spartans used numerous subordinate officers in their battle lines. All of this is picked up, particularly by the Thebans. So the Spartans have a means of commanding these forces through superbly trained citizens who come out of this traditional education with a notion of command, who could put together coalition armies, and in the 4th and 3rd century BC, even be called in by a power like Carthage to whip up an army out of sometimes rather unimpressive elements. So in that sense, the Spartans, the army of the Peloponnesian League was extremely effective. And when the Persians show up, obviously the Spartans and those allies are they're going to defer to the Spartan kings. The Spartans are going to command, not the Athenians. This is a point that needs to be stressed, because if you look at the record of Sparta as a military power from 546 down to 331 BC, spanning most of the classical age, the Spartans maintain their hegemony. They shall beat the Athenians in the Peloponnesian War.
Ja,